Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest is Dr. Evan Medeiros, who currently teaches at Georgetown University. He served in the U.S. government from 2009 to 2015 and left his public service as the Senior Director of Asia at the White House National Security Council. He recently authored a paper to examine the domestic politics of U.S.-China relations. With the U.S. elections later this year, many people are watching closely, not only because it's looking like a rematch of 2024 Biden versus Trump, but also because of the policy implications of a second Trump administration. So today, we would like Evan to share his insights. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you, Wenqi. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what is the objective of this paper? We've seen a lot of media reporting on how Congress influences policymaking, especially on China and Taiwan, but I'm not sure if there was anything as analytical as this paper in the past. Am I right?
Yes, that's right. So this paper has two goals. Number one, to identify and analyze the changing sources, domestic sources, and forces influencing America's relationship with China, and to do the same thing on the Chinese side. So it was very much about identifying what's going on in the US and identifying what's going on in China, because a lot of the research to date has just focused on Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And my paper looks much broader than Congress. And very little of that research always also connects the US side with the Chinese side. So it's about, trying to present a more holistic picture of the domestic actors, the domestic processes, the domestic forces in both countries that are influencing the US-China relationship. And in particular, on the US side, it's not just Congress. It's electoral politics, it's interest group politics, it's public opinion, it's bureaucratic politics. There's a lot going on the US side, in addition to the growing role of Congress.
Well, obviously, I think you've identified 5 different sort of actors on the U.S. domestic political side of things. And we still have to talk about the role of Congress because it's so prominent. So if you can kind of give our audience an overview of just the foreign policy making power of the U.S. Congress and how it has evolved over time when it comes to China-related policy.
Yeah, so Congress historically has had two main powers to influence foreign policy. The first is what's called oversight. So that's ability to conduct hearings, conduct investigations, and sort of shape the debate, and at times look into whether or not U.S. government agencies are spending their money well. So that's oversight. The second responsibility is legislation, and that can be legislation to spend money, giving people money or taking money away, or legislation that puts in place new legal and regulatory frameworks that would influence the US-China relationship. A very good example of that recently would be new laws to improve and expand export controls, new laws to expand inward investment screening in the United States. The Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act is another good one. Of course, famously, there's the Taiwan Relations Act, that goes back to 1979. So the legislative power is a big one. And then you could say there's sort of a third one, which is just the activities of the members of Congress. Yes. And that's particularly relevant to Taiwan because when members of Congress travel to Taiwan, they say what they believe, which, obviously creates challenges for both the United States and Taiwan to manage the US-China relationship well.
Yeah, and you obviously, in addition to Congress and their, these other interest groups, public opinion, et cetera, and for political parties as well, I'm going to quote from this paper. You said both parties now see China as a vehicle for taking policy actions that support their longstanding political and domestic priorities, and both sides get something out of competition with China. So what do both political parties get out of competition with China?
Well, the point I was trying to make there was first and foremost the increase in congressional activism. The fact that Congress is more interested in China and more active in China is due first and foremost to the fact that they see a greater number of threats and challenges emanating from China. Their views of China and the China challenge have changed, and as a result, they want to be more active. So that's the primary motivation. And I think it's important for listeners to understand their views of China have changed. But there's also a related one, which is a more political motive. In other words, there may be members of Congress who aren't particularly focused on China. They don't have expertise on China, but they know that focusing on China will help them gain broad congressional support for their domestic agendas. And that domestic agenda could be more spending on clean energy. It could be greater social welfare spending, assistance to American workers. So, in other words, both Democrats and Republicans have their domestic policy priorities, and it's possible that they could link those domestic policy priorities to broader momentum in the Congress for doing things on China. And I think when you look at some of the pieces of legislation that have recently passed, like the CHIPS Act or even the Inflation Reduction Act, they're China and competing with China and positioning America to compete with China over the long term is a big motivation in which there's bipartisan support. And if both parties are able to use that to gain support for very specific domestic initiatives, members of Congress are happy to do that as well.
Well, in other words, I think China has just become an issue that's very easy to galvanize, support, and mobilize resources, on various domestic political agenda. But there is a big worry in the Asian American community that, especially with electoral politics, that may have given rise to the recent anti-Asian hate. Obviously, it started with the Trump administration during the peak of the COVID pandemic. Some of the words he said was considered very offensive, but it seems to have continued into the Biden administration. I'll just give one example, right? So the Ohio Democratic Congressman Tim Ryan's anti-China rhetoric during the 2022 campaign actually led to wide range of protests from Asian American groups and his Democratic colleagues. So what are your thoughts on this? I mean, are the sort of our hawkish China policy unintentionally sort of led to this kind of consequence?
Yeah, it concerns me greatly. And we, Americans need to be very, very careful about making sure that our debates and discussions about China don't turn into anti-Asian hate, right? And clearly, those two issues are becoming blurred. They're especially becoming blurred in the electoral process. So, when members of the House or the Senate are running for re-election, making sure that their criticism of China is not a criticism of Chinese Americans, given all they've contributed, and the broader, Asian American Pacific Islander community in the United States, which is an important part of American society. It contributes a lot to us. Obviously, the United States has a very checkered record of bias and prejudice against Chinese and Japanese, putting Japanese in internment camps during World War II. So we need to be very, very sensitive to this, and we need to make sure that we oppose anti-Asian hate speech and associated actions at every opportunity.
Yeah. Well, the U.S. domestic politics is very complicated, but because there's actually a transparency, so at least it's easier for people to analyze and see the interactions between domestic and foreign policies. But we're going to switch gears to China, which is much harder to understand because of its own opaque political system. So you've also noted in the report the changes in China's domestic politics, the more recently, sort of the two features, centralization and politicization. If you could just kind of elaborate on that for our audience. And also, on top of that is so much of it is attributed to Xi Jinping. So how big is Xi Jinping's role in all this?
I mean, Xi Jinping has a very big role. He has the biggest and most important role. I mean, he is centralized decision making within the Central Committee apparatus for most decisions, foreign policy and domestic affairs. But foreign policy decisions are especially centralized under Xi Jinping. And when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, he really is the one that makes the call about how the relationship should be handled. So I think the fact that I document in the first part of the report that talks about Chinese perceptions and policies, the fact that his views toward about the United States have deteriorated quite substantially. And he said so publicly about a year ago when he talked about the United States carrying out containment, suppression, and encirclement of China. So I think Xi Jinping is the most important person when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship. And the fact that his views have deteriorated, the fact that he centralized decision making so much and politicized it, I think has created an environment where it's just much more difficult to manage the U.S.-China relationship, and everything comes down to what Xi Jinping believes and is willing to act on.
And do you believe that his perception of the US, well, first of all, what's sort of creating this perceptional changes, right? Number one. And number two, has that led to the changes of his own domestic political agenda? Because in the past, I think there was always a debate that, China actually cares much more about its own domestic issues, less about external environment. But now, are we seeing sort of a reverse kind of a factor? Um,
Reverse in what sense?
in the sense that China in the past has said that, they prioritize domestic issues, right? Growth, development, and foreign policy seems to be sort of, as their way of increase their influence, but ultimately it's about its own domestic, whether it's development. They like to use the word modernization or development. But do you think sort of the changing global environment is making him feel that he has to, emphasize national security over domestic economic interests and growth, etc.? That's what I meant by sort of almost like a reverse.
Right. So I think the way to think about it is for Xi Jinping, domestic affairs and foreign affairs are inextricably linked. You can't really divide them up. And the
Mhm.
fact that Xi Jinping is now focused not just on growth, but priorities like national security and self-sufficiency are a reflection of how he sees the external environment. And I believe the fact that he's come to the conclusion that he's now locked in a long-term strategic competition with the United States. So he's starting to rewire and reconfigure the Chinese economy for that long-term competition with the United States. The question is, can he do that in a way that doesn't also jeopardize the continued growth and
Yes.
evolution of the Chinese economy? And of course, the Chinese economy is having a lot of huge problems right now. And so I think that perhaps some of his, initiatives and his intense focus on national security has spooked international investors. It is spooked probably even Chinese business people, right? Global confidence in the Chinese economy is at an all-time low. So I think uh, Xi Jinping is really having a hard time sort of reconciling his worldview, which includes negative views and pessimism about the United States and the U.S.-China relationship, with China's economic challenges and its economic trajectory.
You talked a lot about national security under Xi. How does he define national security?
Well, he defines it incredibly broadly. That's the whole issue. is that when he articulated almost 10 years ago what he calls his national security perspective or national security outlook, it sort of everything was included: political security, social security, food security, energy security, right? I think he had something like 11 or 13 different definitions of national security. So what's clear is that national security is now become come on par with growth and development in terms of priorities, right? It used to be growth over
Mm-hmm.
everything. And now the party talks about finding the right balance between development and security. And as a result, you see the internal security services in China becoming much more active. And that includes their activism on the US-China relationship. And they're being used by Xi Jinping now to carry out economic policies.
Mm-hmm.
They're getting in the game of visas as well. I mean, we should expect national security concerns to be dominant for China for a very long time under Xi.
But do you think, I mean, we always view Beijing as this like very controlling, um, actor, right? So in national security, controlling makes sense. And can you truly control the economic sector? So, the growth aspect of it, for example, you said sort of now, growth and security are sort of on part with each other. Is that intentional, or do you think today's China's economic situation is also a surprise to him? Because we see a lot of government putting out, measures and trying to almost in some way, you know, make the economic growth come back. But I'm not sure if it's working out, and maybe it's too short of a time for us to, see any real impact on it. But, and then there are people who say, well, this is intentional because, she wants to adjust its economic growth model to something that is, more about high quality rather than this like, growth, regardless of quality. What is your view on
I
what
think
he's thinking? Yeah.
a little bit of both when Xi. So I think on the one hand, Xi Jinping is trying very deliberately to rewire the Chinese economy. He doesn't want, he's trying to shift from the old growth drivers, export and investment, to new growth drivers. But he doesn't want the new growth drivers to be consumption and services. He wants to reduce the role of investment in infrastructure and real estate. He wants to shift to an economy that's principally driven by advanced manufacturing, right? He wants to upgrade in a high-tech way the Chinese economy. Now, of course, consumption and services and investment will always be there, but he really wants it to be the main engine of the economy to be advanced manufacturing. And the Chinese talk about developing their economy as a center of excellence for new energy vehicles, clean energy technologies, batteries,
Mhm.
and the machines
Yeah.
that facilitate advanced manufacturing. So, in some ways, the effort to unwind or deflate the bubble of the property sector is actually a very deliberate effort. It's probably proven a little bit more challenging than they had expected,
Mhm.
but Xi Jinping has clearly indicated he has a greater tolerance for austerity than others. Look, China, at least officially, still got over 5% growth last year, which is quite good for an
Yeah.
economy of its size. So I don't think that he or they are nearly as concerned as outside watchers of the economy. I think where they're concerned is about sentiment and confidence,
Hmm.
and both onshore confidence in China, especially among consumers, and offshore confidence among global investors is way down. And they're
Yeah.
not really sure how to deal with that. And Xi Jinping is not willing to support a big policy stimulus that would make everybody feel a lot better. And so, while as I said, I think this is a very deliberate effort to rewire the economy to move to these new drivers with advanced manufacturing at the core. I think that they're having some difficulty doing it. And it's not really clear to me if Xi Jinping really understands the severity of some of the problems that they face today. And that's, of course, remember, this is all within the context of, demographic challenges for China really starting to bite as the working age population pretty rapidly contracts, and the old population is growing pretty quickly, creating all sorts of government liabilities for taking care of them. So I think it's quite a mixed picture, but I don't think Xi Jinping is terribly concerned. Frankly, I think Xi Jinping, if you were to ask him, he still thinks China is rising, that they're going through a transition period, but the trajectory remains a very positive one and upward.
Yeah, it sounds like it is deliberate, at least according to some of the reporting and writing as well. But, do you think then the US and China still need each other economically? Both countries have relied on each other for growth for a while. And do you think it is trending towards, I don't want to just randomly use the word decoupling, but it seems that both countries are indeed trying to de-risk and be more independent with its own, sectors when they have those national security concerns.
I think the United States and China remain interdependent economically, ecologically, technologically, and in other ways. That is simply just a fact, right? Our two-way trade relationship is, somewhere between $600 and $700 billion. So that is real and that is meaningful. The question for the United States and China is, how are we going to balance our growing number of diplomatic and security disagreements with our economic interaction?
Well, so what would you predict for the next 18 months of US-China relations, and especially if there's another Trump administration?
So the next 18 months really depend on whether or not Trump gets elected. If Trump gets elected, we should expect a lot of uncertainty and volatility. His people have also already talked about massive increases in tariffs toward China, for example, right? So that's a possibility that's out there. Now, if Trump doesn't get elected, I think the Biden policy of managed competition will continue, and I think the Chinese will try and extend further this sort of current era of dialogue and stability in the relationship. Now, it could be disrupted by a North Korea crisis. It could be disrupted by something that Russia does. I mean, the US and China are in a long-term strategic competition that increasingly has ideological elements. But what's notable is that we're in a period where the Chinese have re-embraced the idea of dialogue, and that dialogue can help create an environment to manage the most difficult issues in the relationship, including dialogue on sensitive questions like artificial intelligence and dialogue between our two militaries, which may eventually evolve perhaps into greater emphasis on crisis management. So I think the U.S.-China relationship under Biden is on a more stable trajectory, but the fundamentals of our strategic competition have not changed.
So what would be your advice to, let's say, governments in the region, let's just say Taiwan, to prepare for a potential Trump administration? What do they need to do?
Well, to me, the two key strategies are always resilience and diversification, right? Diversify so you're not dependent on any one person. For Taiwan, on the defense side, that's obviously difficult because the United States is its biggest defense partner. But one of the most interesting things about the Taiwan issue in recent years is that it's really become a global issue. And there are European countries, as well as Asian countries, American allies and partners, that care a lot about Taiwan. So Taiwan has more friends and more influential friends than ever before. And I think that's a good thing for Taiwan, and that's a good thing for cross-strait relations because it contributes to strategic deterrence. So if I'm Taiwan, I want to make sure that I continue to invest in those relationships with the UK, with France, with Germany, with the European Union in Brussels, Japan, South Korea, Central European states, Australia. I think that can only be good and important for Taiwan.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Evan. It's really nice to hear from you, who has spent lots of time in the government in the most important decision-making positions on Asia, as well now in the private sector and academic sector. So hope to have you back in the future, but thank you so much today.
Great to be here.